Good evening, everyone. My name is David Myers. I teach in the history department in UCLA, and I'm the director of the UCLA Bedari Kindness Institute. And I'm pleased to welcome you to the first winter quarter event in our Compassionate Conversation series. Before I say anything more about the series, I'd like to thank our Bedari Kindness Institute staff and our dear friends at the Division of Social Sciences Development for all of their work in making this evening's event possible. Thank you so much for your help. So our next event will be on February 24th, and it will feature a multi-faith panel devoted to the questions of justice, forgiveness, and compassion. And there are flyers outside with a QR code to register for that event. I know that spaces are filling up rapidly, so please do take a flyer and register. But let me just say a word about what we were trying to do in this series. So our general mission in this series is twofold, both to bring a measure of critical scholarly rigor to our understanding and study of kindness, and to model what it is to engage kindly with one another. We often think of these as two mutually exclusive goals, but in fact they are not. And I think tonight will be a good example of how they can coexist in rather harmonious fashion. Running through our events this year is the theme of kindness to the stranger, an ancient principle that is mentioned many times in the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, and other scriptural sources in antiquity. There, in the Hebrew Bible in particular, the impulse to treat the stranger kindly entails an important psychological exercise. That is, one should treat a stranger kindly because you, in this case, Israelites, were once strangers in Egypt. Empathy, in this sense, was linked to the historical recognition that we have all, at some point in our collective lives, come as new arrivals to a new place, been strangers at one point or another. It seems almost too banal to say how absent that lesson seems to be today in our country, and in so many other places in the world where overt and deep-seated hostility to the immigrant, to the refugee, to the stranger anchors an illiberal politics of exclusion. Apropos the stranger, I'm often reminded of the famous short essay by the German sociologist Georg Simmel from 1908, who described the stranger as both near and far, proximate in physical, spatial terms, but distant in perceived attributes or culture. That tension or paradox of the stranger is something that we see played out in contemporary political discourse, with advocates and opponents of immigration adopting the tropes of likeness and otherness to make their cases. Insofar as population movement will likely only be increasing as climate and political instability increase, we must figure out how we are going to navigate that tension. Are we better or worse off for having immigrants and open rather than closed borders in our society? I have a clear answer to that question. Some of you may have another answer, but we are going to need to figure out how we relate to immigrants, refugees, exiles in our midst, and thus the rationale for today's conversation. Our speaker, Professor Claire Adida, is a nationally known expert in diversity in society, more specifically in the comparative study of immigrants in societies ranging from West Africa to France to the United States. Claire Adida is a senior fellow at the Center for Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law at the Freeman Spogli Institute at Stanford University, and also a professor by courtesy in the Department of Political Science. She is the author of a number of important works, which I'd like to mention. First, from 2016, Why Muslim Integration Fails in Christian Heritage Societies. And from 2014, Immigrant Exclusion and Insecurity in Africa, Co-Ethnic Strangers, along with dozens of articles on related themes. She'll address us for about 30 minutes on the topic of the politics of migrant scapegoating. And then we are fortunate to have two excellent commentators or respondents, both esteemed colleagues at UCLA. First, Hiroshi Motomura, who is the Susan Westerberg Distinguished Professor of Law at UCLA, where he co-directs the Center for Immigration Law and Policy. He is the author of many articles and a number of important books, including most recently, in 2025, Borders and Belonging Toward a Fair Immigration Policy. And our second commentator will be Abel Valenzuela, Professor of Urban Studies and Chicana Studies, and Dean of the UCLA Division of Social Sciences. He is the author of many articles on immigrants, labor, and poverty, as well as co-editor of Prismatic Metropolis and Immigrants and Crime. And I'm really delighted that we were able to offer this site of refuge for Abel from his daily, hourly administrative duties and allow him to return to his identity as a scholar.
Thank you.
We have a very exciting and stimulating program ahead. And without further ado, I'd like to invite to the podium Professor Claire Adida.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here and to share some of the research that I've been doing over the past few years. So I'm going to be talking to you about the politics of migrant scapegoating, narratives of exclusion and inclusion. So migrant scapegoating is not a new phenomenon. It's been going on for ages, for as long as we've had migration. But what we've seen over the past few years, and I would say particularly the past few months, is what happens when the highest levels of government engage unabashedly in migrant scapegoating. What I have up here is a tweet from the Department of Homeland Security from November, not too long ago, that blames the affordability crisis on, quote, millions of criminal illegals in our country. Rent is too high, groceries cost too much, there aren't enough jobs, women don't feel safe walking down the street, et cetera, et cetera. There are millions of criminal illegals in our country. Now, we know what drives people to want to exclude migrants. There's a lot of work in social sciences that has done this research. I've done some of this research. We know that when folks feel threatened, when they feel that their status is threatened, they turn to exclusion. We know this from sociology. We know this from political science, from economics. And there's three types of threats in particular that lead to migrant exclusion, to people wanting to adopt, preferring policies of exclusion. There's the narrative that migrants present an economic threat. They're here to steal your jobs, or they're here to use up all government resources and services. There's the narrative that migrants present a cultural threat. They are here and will threaten your cultural values and your norms. And then I think we've seen more recently a lot of narratives on migrants as a physical threat, in that they threaten your security because they bring disease or crime or terror. So we know there's a lot of research on this. Happy to talk about this more in the Q&A. I've done some of this work as well, particularly in my research on Muslim exclusion, immigrant exclusion in France, and then Muslim refugee exclusion in the United States. But recently, in the past few years, I've kind of turned the tables a little bit and wanted to think about inclusion instead of exclusion. And I wanted to ask, how can we increase inclusion instead? I think that this is a question, we have to ask this question, right? This is an age of mass migration, of polarization. We know that social order and social harmony are challenged by that. And so we have to think about how can we get back to more social cohesion. There's a lot of work that's looking at factors, big structural factors, like the economic integration of migrants, giving them access to jobs. It helps their integration. It helps with inclusion. There's work on legal integration, giving them access to legal services and benefits, to naturalization, work on the political mobilization of migrants. All that is out there. There's a lot of research on this. But what I want to look at are narratives. I want to argue that narratives also matter. Really? Narratives matter? Yes, I think that narratives matter, and I think that what we've seen over the past few months should convince us that narratives matter tremendously. Every now and then I'll check myself and I'll ask myself, are we sure that these things matter as much as, making sure migrants have access to jobs or to political participation? And then, I'll read the news and I'll be convinced myself again and again that yes, narratives matter. So this is just an article from The Atlantic a couple of days ago that shows what happens when the highest levels of government adopt narratives of exclusion, right? A narrative that social bonds form among people who have something in common, and if you stop importing millions of foreigners into the country, you allow social cohesion to form naturally. Okay, so narratives matter. And so what narratives, more precisely, increase inclusion? And here, I want to propose that Aristotle offers a really nice categorization for thinking about the types of strategies for increasing inclusion. Back when he was writing about rhetoric and how to use language to persuade, he created this typology of strategies for persuading. You could persuade others by appealing to your authority as a speaker. So I could put an argument forward and say, believe me, I'm an expert, you should listen to me. So that is one category of strategies. Another are narratives that appeal to the audience's emotions, and I'll get to that in a second. And then a third are narratives that appeal to logic and facts, logos, okay? I've done work on all three of these. Today, I'm going to focus on the last two, narratives that appeal to emotions and narratives that appeal to facts. And I just want to take a second to highlight that this is not research I've done on my own. There's an amazing team of folks I've worked with, Adeline Lowe, Melina Platas, Lauren Prather, and Scott Williamson. Okay, so the strategy, let's start with the strategy of appealing to logics and facts. What we know about misconceptions, people have misconceptions about others, about outgroups. These are common. This is just a normal state of being. We also know that misconceptions about outgroups correlate with negative attitudes towards outgroups. So the more misconceptions you have about outgroups, the more you're likely to want to have hostility towards them. This is not a causal claim, it's just these things kind of move together. And yet, when it comes to attitudes towards migrants, a lot of the research shows that when you try to correct misconceptions, it doesn't really do much. There's quite a famous study by Hopkins and co-authors from 2019 where they did 7 separate survey experiments over 11 years where they tried to correct people's misconceptions about immigrants. And they found that these had very small effects. My own work from a few years back on attitudes towards Syrian refugees, this was in the midst of the Syrian refugee crisis, we found that an information message to a representative sample of Americans, when you give them information about how many Syrian refugees the US government committed to resettling and how little that was relative to other countries like Germany or Canada, it didn't really matter to people. It didn't lead to any increase in inclusionary attitudes. So we know that people have misconceptions, and we know that misconceptions are correlated with negative attitudes. And yet, when we try to correct misconceptions, it doesn't seem to do much. So what we propose in our research is that, well, 3 things have to be true for correcting misconceptions to work. We have to be providing new information, right? Sometimes we provide information, people already knew it. We have to be providing salient information. Not all information is salient to people's preferences, right? You may be anti-migrant because you believe that they are more likely to commit crimes. If I give you a piece of information about how migrants, how fluent they are in English, the proportion of migrants who can speak fluent English, it's not really going to do anything to your attitudes towards migrants because that was not salient to your preferences of exclusion. And then the third condition is that people have to not be motivated to resist the information. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with this concept of motivated reasoning, which is basically that folks are more likely to accept information that confirms their priors, that is consistent with their priors, and they're more likely to question information that, that challenges their priors. And so if we want to give people new information that will change their attitudes towards migrants, we have to make sure they're not busy engaging in motivated reasoning where they're just going to reject what we have to say. Okay, let's turn to the second strategy, which is appealing to emotions. And here, the emotion I want to talk about is empathy. So there's quite a bit of work across different social sciences that shows that empathy, that narratives that ask people to take the perspective of someone else, put yourself in the shoes of a Syrian refugee. Or narratives, so that's a perspective-taking narrative, or narratives that just tell you the story of someone else. That's a perspective-getting narrative. These are small differences, but they're narratives that are meant to generate empathy in you. That can reduce prejudice towards outgroups. And there's actually quite a bit of empirical evidence that shows that this is the case for a number of different groups. I've listed a few here: attitudes towards undocumented migrants, towards trans community. I've done work on Syrian refugees, attitudes towards ethnic minorities. Here I'm talking about the Roma in Hungary. Okay, so there's a lot of empirical evidence that shows that this actually does work. But there's also empathy skeptics. The skeptics say that actually empathy-based interventions can actually make things worse. They can exacerbate polarization and in-group bias because of empathy bias. And what we mean by empathy bias is that it takes effort to empathize. If I ask you to empathize with someone, it's going to take cognitive effort. It's going to take emotional effort. You may not want to. You may not want to feel those feelings. And because it takes effort, it's natural for individuals to empathize with people who are more like them. And if that's the case, what Jamil Zaki, a colleague at Stanford, calls motivated empathy, that you only empathize with folks you're motivated to empathize with, if that's the case, then we're just making things worse, right? We're reproducing, we're even exacerbating in-group bias and favoritism. So the question that we want to ask in this research is, well, can we empathize with folks who are very different from us? Can we push that to the limit? So we want to design an intervention. We want to test a strategy that's going to address these challenges. We want to correct a common and salient misconception that Americans have about refugees. This is a study about refugees here. We want to address the concerns of empathy skeptics by coming up with a hard test for empathy. And we want to take seriously the likelihood of motivated reasoning. We want to make sure folks are open to new information. So how did we do this? I'm going to walk you through 3 studies that we did to get at these objectives. The first study we did in the fall of 2019, every time these are representative samples of Americans, we basically set out to just try it. It was a descriptive study where we tried to understand, what do people know about refugees? What misconceptions do they have about refugees? And which misconceptions most strongly correlate with their attitudes towards refugees? So which misconceptions best predict whether you're going to have, whether you prefer to exclude refugees or not? So the goal here is to come up with the best possible information intervention. The second study, the spring of 2021, we wanted to test a couple different empathy interventions where we changed the identity of the protagonist that we're asking you to think about, to empathize with, where we make the protagonist more or less culturally different from an average American. And then in the third study, after we've come up with our best information intervention, our hardest empathy intervention, we then went ahead and we tested these interventions, both individually and bundled together, to see if they had any effect on people's attitudes towards refugees. So the first study I want to remind you is about understanding what misconceptions people have about refugees. So we asked folks to give us their best guesses on a number of questions that were supposed to capture the common tropes you hear against refugees, right? So how many refugees did we admit in the US, right? So in blue here, you see the tropes that these questions are meant to address. The demographics of refugees, are we letting in women and children more? Are we letting in more Christians or Muslims? How well do they speak English, whether the refugees pay taxes, whether they have committed any terrorist activity, and how many months of security vetting do refugees go through, all right? So we asked all these questions. What we find is that the average respondent, this may not be very surprising to most folks, underestimates the proportion of refugees who are women and children, underestimates the proportion of refugees who are Christian, overestimates the proportion of terrorist attacks committed by refugees, does not know the top refugee sending countries, and does not know that refugees pay taxes. But what caught our eye, really, was that people really were mistaken about how much security vetting refugees go through. So the answer to that question is, on average, 18 to 24 months. But you'll talk to anyone in the refugee resettlement world, and they'll tell you it can take a lot longer. We say 18 to 24 months, but folks are waiting for much longer as well. So the truth is 18 to 24 months of security vetting. And what I show you here is a distribution of people's answers, right? So as you have about under 10% said no refugee vetting at all. If you just look at the folks who underestimated it, it's about 60%. So Americans underestimate the security vetting of refugees. And the other thing that was really interesting about this is, don't worry about trying to understand all of these coefficients, but what this is showing you is that the more wrong people were about security vetting, the more likely they were to have exclusionary attitudes towards refugees. And that was particularly true about being wrong on the security vetting questions. So if you were wrong about the English fluency questions, or if you were wrong about paying taxes, it didn't predict your attitudes towards refugees as well as being wrong about security vetting. So the more wrong you are about the length of security vetting, the more anti-refugee you were. So what does that mean? That means that it seems that we have found a piece of information that is new and that is salient, okay? How long refugees are vetted for. Okay, let's turn to study 2. Probing the limits of empathy. So here what we did is, it was a very short narrative. We presented a very short narrative about Abdi, who is a refugee from Somalia. And actually, this was years ago, is a refugee from Somalia living in Minneapolis. We didn't know what would happen a few years later, but that was our narrative. And some folks in the survey got this version of the narrative describing Abdi as a refugee, and some described him as a Muslim refugee. So the test here is, can we get the same empathetic response when we're talking about a Muslim refugee? And we measured their response in 3 ways. We looked at their personal feelings of warmth towards refugees on a scale from 0 to 100. How warmly do you feel towards refugees? This is a common measure in political science. We asked about their policy preference. So every year, the president sets a refugee cap. We asked them if they prefer to keep it the same, increase it, or decrease it. And then we asked them if they would be willing to write a letter to the president to advocate for that policy. And we actually had them write the letter. They said yes, and then we actually sent the letters. We did this to try to get at a somewhat more behavioral measure of attitudes towards refugees. So what did we find? What this table shows you is that when folks got the narrative about a refugee, they indeed were more likely to feel warmly towards refugees. They were more likely to want to increase the refugee cap, and they were more likely to write a letter to advocate for that. But it was also the case that they had this response when they got the narrative about a Muslim refugee. So here you just want to compare the numbers in the first and the second row. They're positive, they're statistically significant. So you see that the effect is there, but it is muted in some cases. So especially for the refugee cap, right? It's halved. The size of the effect is much smaller when we're talking about a Muslim refugee than when we're talking about just a refugee. So there is some truth to this empathy bias. It is easier to empathize with some people than others. However, there's still movement here. We're still moving people towards more inclusion. So we found a hard test for empathy, a test about a Muslim refugee. So now we have our 3 interventions. Don't worry that you can't really read these, but these are the 3 interventions that we're now going to plug into our 3rd survey to test these when we are presenting the interventions separately and together. So here is our information intervention. This is a paragraph informing folks about the refugee vetting process, which organizations are involved, how long it takes. We tell them 18 to 24 months. They can also click to see an infographic. The middle one is a perspective-getting narrative. This is a narrative about a Muslim refugee in Midwestern United States. So we did not specify which state. And this is exactly the same text as these two. They're bundled together. So here we embed the information about security vetting within a narrative about a refugee, okay? So we are going to present our survey takers with 3 versions of the same survey. Actually 4 versions. Some are getting none of this. They're just being asked how they feel about refugees. 1/4 are getting just the information. 1/4 are getting just the narrative. And 1/4 are getting the 2 combined. So this is just a repetition of what I just said. We have a pretty large sample. We have 4 different versions of the same survey, and then we are measuring, after we assign people randomly to one of these versions, we measure, first of all, whether they update. Did they learn? Did they take in the new information about security vetting? We measure how warmly they feel towards refugees. We measure their policy preferences about raising the cap or not. And then we measure whether they wrote a letter to advocate for that. Recall our 3 objectives. We want to know the effect of new and salient information. We want to test a hard case to see if empathy really works on a hard case in spite of empathy bias. And then we want to see if bundling the 2 together does anything extra. And the reason why we do that is because of this issue of motivated reasoning, right? We know that empathy, when you ask somebody to empathize with someone else, you're asking them to open their mind. And so we hypothesize that maybe what this is doing is it's making them less resistant to new information. So maybe when you bundle information with empathy, maybe you actually you increase the effect of each of these interventions. Okay, so the results. I'm going to walk you through our results. We have 4 outcomes that we're interested in. In the top left is the results on whether people updated correctly. Did they take in the new information about 18 to 24 months? In the top right is how warmly they feel towards refugees. In the bottom left is their preferences towards the refugee cap. And in the bottom right is whether they wrote a letter in support of that preference. If you see in a coefficient that's to the right of the dashed 0 line, that means that is an effect that is inclusionary, right? That increased inclusion. If you see that the bars are crossing the vertical line, then that effect is not statistically significant. We cannot say that it's there. So we have our 3 interventions. We have the piece of information, we have the narrative, and we have the 2 bundled together. At the top, what you see is that the piece of information, when you give people a piece of information about how much security vetting folks go through, it worked. People updated. Right? That coefficient is really far to the right here. People are updating when we tell them this information. Of course, they're not updating when we tell them just the narrative, because the narrative didn't include the information. And then the 3rd row has the narrative and the information, and so it also increased updating. But then when you look at the effect of information in every other box, you see that it crosses the line, or even worse, right here, that there might be a backfire effect. So the effect of just providing information is narrow and may create some backfire effect on people's attitudes towards refugees. However, the effect of just providing a narrative, it has the effects that we would expect to see. It increases people's warmth towards refugees. It increases their policy preferences for increasing the cap. And it makes them more likely to write a letter to advocate for that. And then when you put the two together, what do you see? You see that you have movement on all four outcomes towards inclusion. You do not see what we thought might happen, that they enhance one another. They don't enhance one another. Empathy doesn't make information work better. Information doesn't make empathy work better. But together, they do move all the outcomes that we measured. So to recap, information, just providing information, even though it was a good piece of information, it was new and it was salient, it had an effect, but it was narrow. It was just that people updated, but they didn't change their attitudes. And they might even have had a backfire effect, actually. Providing a narrative, a perspective-getting narrative, did increase inclusion. It didn't increase people's updating because that's normal. We didn't tell them anything about the vetting. And then bundling the two, perspective-getting with information, increased all of it. It increased updating, it increased inclusion, and importantly here, it might guard against the backfire effect. You notice this last red dot here shows you that the negative effect of information on increasing the refugee cap is gone, and we're back to a positive effect. So to summarize the findings, even our best information intervention had limited effects, and even our hardest case for empathy had broad inclusionary effects. When you combine the two, you see improvements everywhere. You don't see that there's an extra boost from combining the two. But you do see maybe that you can protect against potential backfire effects. Which brings me back to, as Adam Serwer wrote, the neighborism of the Twin Cities, whose quote, whose people do not share the narcissism of being capable of loving only those who are exactly like them. I think, again, just to repeat how I started, how I motivated the talk, we're in an age of mass migration. That's not going away. And we are in a country that is very polarized. That's unlikely to go away as well. And we still have to find a way to work together and to thrive together. So how do you get back to more social cohesion? I do think that narratives matter, and I hope to have shown you that empathy matters. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you all for being here. I mean, this is such wonderful research, and it's very important. What I want to do is to build on Claire's presentation by actually introducing another dimension to it. And it's a dimension that I think resonates with, essentially with current news and current events. And so I was thinking, so I have two granddaughters. One of them is 5 and one is 8. And they usually don't ask me what I'm going to be talking about. So this is all hypothetical. But if they were to ask me what I was talking about, I would say I'm going to give a talk or respond to a talk. The title is Kindness to the Stranger. So I'm pretty sure that if they followed up at all, that they would say, I think they have a pretty good sense of what it means to be kind. But of course, at least the older granddaughter would say, what do you mean by the stranger? What is that? And then I would be forced to explain it as if, this is often useful for me, is to explain how I would write a children's book about these issues. And I think the first question that my granddaughter would ask me is, where does the stranger live? Is this a new kid on the block? Is it someone who is on the other side of the town, or is it someone far, far away that I have to take the plane to see? Is it just someone I see on television and so forth? And it made me think about these things matter. And so the dimension I want to add is to really think about how we think about migration, migrants, and immigrants, and the position of immigrants in any society, whether that debate, discussion, that inclusion perhaps is local or regional or national? Because I think it makes a difference, and it's very complicated, but I think that these questions are very much at the center of what's going on in Minneapolis right now. It's very much in the center of Los Angeles. And, you know, it's been really central, I think, to a lot of migration politics in the United States and in many other countries, actually, as far back as we can think. So immigration law and entry into the country is traditionally federal. That's written into a lot of different things, and it's, you know, accepted law. But I wanted to look more carefully about what it means to think about inclusion on a state and local level. And states and localities have gotten involved in immigration-related issues quite a bit, certainly lately, and I would say throughout American history. This can take two forms. One is that the inclusion or exclusion of those attitudes manifest themselves in helping federal enforcement, and that can happen in a couple different ways. One is to transfer people from state and local custody to federal authorities, and another is information sharing. But there's a lot of other cities, Los Angeles, I think, is generally one of them, is to try to neutralize federal enforcement by providing sanctuary. And that usually takes a couple of forms. One is to minimize assistance to federal enforcement by state and local police. And another is curbing detention in the state or locality. And we've seen this in California. We've certainly seen this in Los Angeles and other cities. So that some of the state and local decision making takes place in the arena of enforcement and enforcement neutralization. And the other arena which takes place is what you might call fostering inclusion, right? Really acting on the I'm going to treat my neighbor as if I treat someone who'd been there for a while, I suppose. And fostering inclusion can take many forms. One is something like, do you get a driver's license? Do you get a driver's license? Another one that's very much actually under challenge in California and in a handful of other states is whether California can offer in-state tuition to people, many of whom are undocumented. Interestingly, many of whom are U.S. citizens because of the way the law is written. Another is whether you could have public benefits eligibility, and another is whether you can vote, which is the case in a few cities around the country, including in San Francisco school board elections, if you have children there. So the question really is, on this dimension of inclusion, exclusion, and kindness to the stranger, does it really matter if decision-making is done on a state and local basis or on a federal basis? Does it matter if the stranger is living next door to you or in some faraway place? I think there's reasons to think that it might. I mean, this is not something I've tested, but it's a couple of reasons, three reasons I think at least worth naming to think it might, that proximity may matter. One is that you may be more likely to see someone as a neighbor or as an employee or as an employer. So that's proximity. The other is the influence of political partisanship in influencing and being influenced by attitudes of exclusion. Will inclusion temper enforcement sentiments, for example, by city officials or not? The political partisanship influence. And the third is the perceived and real effects, especially economic. In other words, there's an abstraction to someone far away, but if someone is not available to provide home health care, for example, that really is very immediate. So I just want to suggest that that's an additional mention to think about this. I also want to name a complication here. It's often, frankly, overlooked or at least avoided by a lot of people who favor sanctuary. But I think there's a way to deal with it that's very forthright and very honest. So I'll try to share it with you. I think the concern in the last 20, 25 years, actually it even goes back way further, but especially since the year 2000, has been if we give California or Los Angeles the authority to act on our inclusive impulses by providing sanctuary, does that also mean that Arizona can hyper-enforce against undocumented immigrants through things like Arizona SB 1070 from 15 years ago, which basically it's the law that some people call the show me your papers law, but it said that you have to, the local and state police had to ask for documentation including lawful status-related documentation of people that they came across in their policing duties. So the question is, I know some people are concerned about a capacious view of state and local decision-making with regard to immigration inclusion, if that will also mean empowering state and local police to do immigration enforcement. In other words, can you argue for in-state tuition at UCLA at the same time, say, with some conceptual and intellectual audience honesty, but you also don't think that UCLA Police Department or LA Police Department should enforce law? And I just want to suggest that I actually think there's a big reason for this, a big difference here that's worth talking about, and that is that the problem with state and local enforcement, I don't think it's state and local enforcement per se. I think it has to do with the specifics of how enforcement happens. Enforcement is highly discretionary. We have a huge mismatch between the law on the books and the law in action. It creates zones with no transparency, where what happens is the police can decide whom to arrest and whom to detain and whom to put in the deportation machinery. There's a high risk of undetected and unremedied discrimination through enforcement patterns. And so the idea that, so I think that empowering exclusion through laws like Arizona SB 1070 for enforcement creates a risk of discrimination that I don't think exists. Targeted discrimination, that is, against an individual, doesn't exist with regard to giving people in-state tuition. And the reason, by the way, is that there's actually, for lawyers, there's a legal test for that, and that is that the cases in trying to challenge in-state tuition brought by private parties have been thrown out of court for lack of standing. In other words, there's no individual stake for this. So, I'm getting maybe too much into some of the legal weeds, but the point really is this, that I think it may make a difference whether one thinks about the strangers next door or not. Therefore, it may make a difference whether the locus of decision-making is state and local or federal, where the inclusion attitudes get operationalized. And let me just close with two observations. I think that the history of the United States, one of the reasons why the best example of the use of state and local power to define who belongs and who doesn't is slavery and the fact that that generated the American Civil War, and the fact that I think created a sort of a reaction against the idea that state and local decision-making should result in some people who belong and some people who are not even defined as people. And so I think that this is a historical lens in which it's important to think about these issues. And the last thing I'll say is that there's a secondary issue here. It's worth flagging, and that is, do individual attitudes towards strangers depends on what kind of strangers we're talking about? But secondarily, does that change the dynamic between people who have these attitudes and the people that are making decisions in local offices and in state offices versus federal offices? One of the concerns I have is that the federal sphere is so polarized in a partisan way, and yet there are signs that on a local level, there's common cause and reaching across the aisle between the business community, for example, and sort of immigrants' rights advocates, and the idea that there's a couple of Republican governors published a very large, I don't know if it was an op-ed or really it's sort of more of a paid piece in the, it's published in many papers, really saying we need to revitalize our economy. So that's an example of how reaching across the aisle can also mean scaling down the perception. So anyway, let me close there because I think this is just I really think your work is important, but I think it's also, I just wanted to tie it to what's going on today with regard to the politics of immigration. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Let me begin by thanking our speaker who traveled to be with us and share her important work, and also to the organizers of our series of compassionate conversations. What I'd like to do is to offer three comments, three sorts of observations about our talk today, which I thought was very interesting, excellent, very well done. Let me begin by relaying a study that I did many, many years ago, about 24 years ago, in which I surveyed day laborers. These are men who mostly look for work on street corners, but also, and this was a finding 24 years ago at Home Depot's home improvement stores, right? They captured lots of our attention in the contemporary context because of many raids. And I suspect that many of the alternative sites, the non-depot sites, likely don't exist. They're disappearing very, very quickly in many of our urban cities. But 24 years ago, it wasn't a big problem. That is, day laborers, about 75% of who are undocumented, would search for work in this very ubiquitous, it's very visible way, all across Los Angeles, but also New York, Seattle, and many other points in between. It actually turns out that in the Midwest, it's one of the lowest concentrations of day laborers, but there is a concentration of immigrants. I surveyed myself and a big team of both graduate and undergraduate students, day laborers nationally, but also here in Los Angeles. And we asked a series of questions, right? It was a really fun exercise to actually put together the many different questions. And I remember a series of questions that you might describe as humanizing questions, right? Questions about size of one's family, questions about activities when not looking for day labor work, like going to church, going to schools, participating in after school activities, participating in other sorts of activities like maybe neighborhood soccer playing. It turns out that day laborers in Los Angeles, a good number of them would go to the Rose Bowl space and they'd have tournaments, soccer tournaments, and they would compete between different corners. So this was a long time ago. And when I put together a report, I vetted the findings with the day laborers themselves. I had a very special relationship with the Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights of Los Angeles that basically provided me with entree to this important community. And so the first draft of the survey fielded all kinds of what I thought were interesting socioeconomic questions about the lives of day laborers. And buried in the middle of the report, or maybe towards the end, were a few questions that really provided a different frame for the day laborers, i.e. they're church going, they believe in family, they send X amount of resources back home to support their children, many of their aspirations to become entrepreneurs, the multiple jobs that they hold here in the United States. And they really, really pushed me to lead, if you will, that report with that narrative, that the narrative that would allow for greater empathy, a narrative that would allow a different perspective of these men. And by coincidence, about 3 months after the release of some of these findings, they being day laborers were on the front cover of Newsweek as part of our immigration problem, again, 24 years ago. Again, there's a lot of visibility of these men looking for work. And I know your survey doesn't survey immigrants themselves, but of our own views in this space. And so part of my comment here is that I think it's very similar how they feel with regards to empathy and surveying and sort of the different roles that they undertake in the United States, especially in the contemporary context. The second comment that I'll offer is something more to do with country of origin and a more explicit focus on where migrants come from and perhaps the current context that for many of us view the attacks at a local level as very racialized, right? And sure enough, you can refer to Minneapolis and conversations of Somalian immigrants. And we have other examples, not only from the Midwest, but also Chicago, Los Angeles, in different spaces where we have different groups of migrants, right? And so the point here that is that race is, I think, very fundamental and important in the same way that we might even, by extension, think of anti-Muslim or Islamophobic or other sorts of identities that are slightly different, or not slightly, but are different than one's race, right? And so the country of origins and country of origin and the focus on race, I think, is really, really important in your work and as that moves forward. And perhaps a call to more explicitly tackle some of these issues. And then the last comment that I'd like to give is focus on empathy bias and how nuanced and complicated that is, I think, in the United States, but also abroad. So here, as you well know, race and immigration status and how data is collected allows us to compare, for example, Mexican Americans in California relative to Mexican immigrants, perhaps in Texas or in Florida. And so you have these very interesting categories that really allow us to look at both in and out group biases, which is something that obviously you're also addressing very differently when you talk about folks outside of these groups, right? But the unique stratification of how we do this in the United States, I think, really gives so much salience to both in and out group ethnic bias that I think that's something to really embrace and really try to understand. It also holds true for Asian groups in the United States, as well as increasingly African groups, as our diversity of migrants to the United States continues to grow, and some would argue clash with the native born. I have a much more nuanced perspective as to how that clashing is played out, but there is some of that going on at a very local level, but it seems to be very minute or very minimal in terms of impacts, both economics and socioeconomic, that in part you highlighted early in your talk. And so I want to salute and congratulate you for your talk and your findings and for the very unique and nuanced findings and points that you make throughout, and to corroborate and to support a lot of what you said. Thank you.
Thank you all for your excellent presentations, beginning with Claire. And we're going to have a conversation amongst us for a bit, and then we'll open up to you for your questions, comments, and feedback. But Claire, wanted to give you the opportunity to reflect on anything that you heard that you feel requires amplification or response before we jump in.
I think just thinking about the discretion of enforcement, I think one of the reasons we are, there's a lot of reasons we are where we are today, but one of the reasons why the president can just come out and say, well, we're going to revoke temporary protected status for this group of folks. And one of the reasons why there is so much discretion
And again, I think let's
in
try it.
enforcement is because we haven't, this country hasn't passed comprehensive immigration reform in decades, right? So the last big comprehensive immigration reform was under Clinton, or even the last time, some people would say under Reagan in 1986, the bill that gave amnesty to millions of undocumented folks. We haven't really been able to pass comprehensive immigration reform. President Obama tried, but it didn't work. And so as a result, since the early 2000s, we've been relying on presidential executive orders. That's how we've done immigration policy, is through executive orders. And the problem with executive orders is you can revoke them, you can decide it's done, you can decide temporary protected status is over, and you end up with groups of folks who are extremely vulnerable as we can unfortunately see today. So I think, you know, my work is very much at the individual level, but I'm not blind to the fact that there's this problem with our institutions, and the polarization of our elites haven't been able to pass comprehensive immigration reform that would have protected a lot of these folks.
Did you want to say something? Yep. Okay. Well, the point you raise about the individual is who interests you raises the question of how we can scale up the narrative intervention to effect serious change. So I'm wondering, what can we do with this insight? When we pair pathos and logos together, info and perspective giving, it's effective at the local individual level. What are we to do with this in a society that is so fractured, especially around this issue? Where would we want to take it? What tools do you think we have as scholars, as social scientists, as policymakers to actually implement a national strategy for narrative giving?
This is really, it's the $1,000,000 question, I think, is like, what's the policy version of what I'm talking about? I wish I knew. There's another strand of research on prejudice reduction that looks at social contact, which is the hypothesis that when you spend meaningful time with others in an environment that is not hierarchical, prejudice goes down. And here the policy solution to that is, well, this is how it works in the military. That's an institution where you see that happening. Or folks point to soccer leagues or sports. That's an institution where you see that happening, or civil service. So what's the equivalent for empathy? I think because this is really about narratives, I think the way to scale up is through media and social media. Of course, there's issues with who owns what and what's being censored, but I think that's kind of the closest, the best way to scale up these insights.
And are you and your colleagues thinking of that very prospect? How actually do we go about transforming social media from a tool that effectively disseminates hate, prejudice, and bigotry and misinformation to a tool that can inculcate and foster empathy?
Does anyone want to answer that? I think you have to guard against kind of the monopoly of ownership by certain partisan folks. But I don't actually have a good answer to that.
Right. Okay. Well, I want to sort of stay at the local level and ask about the Twin Cities, which of course was so much in the news. It happens to be the example that you left us with, and really maybe draw on some of your insights about that mix of empathy and information, and tie it to what Hiroshi was suggesting about thinking much more seriously about the local and regional levels as ones at which you can operationalize significant change. And just ask you to reflect on what you see unfolding in Minneapolis, where we see immense amount of empathy. We see social media playing a role both in providing information and in offering a narrative of empathy, and social media providing exactly the opposite. I'm just sort of curious how what's going on unfolding in Minneapolis plays into your sense that we need to think much more seriously about the local.
Well, this may oversimplify things, but something of which I've actually rarely been accused. I usually overcomplicate them, but
I love your children's book exercise, that thought experiment. That's
all this is about, right? I mean, you got to explain it in those terms. I think what you're seeing in Minneapolis is kindness to the stranger, conflicting with federal intervention to ramp up the hostility or the hate toward a stranger. And I think that this is part of the dynamic because it's political partisanship at the national level clashing with a more tempered view. Now, the more tempered view is not totally, open borders type of thing. I mean, I've actually seen a lot of the rhetoric defending or a lot of the rhetoric pushing back against the federal government is actually very exclusionary in a different dimension because it basically says, well, they're U.S. citizens, and where does that leave people who aren't, right? But still, I do think that you have a clash between some possibility of kindness to the stranger at a local level clashing with political gain. We saw this, I think, in Springfield, Ohio, when the question of whether the Haitian refugees in Ohio were exactly, what their effect was is complicated. But I think everyone agreed locally that they were not eating cats and dogs. But the vice president said, well, whether it's true or not, we need to kind of, it was, I don't know what he said. And I think he meant it was metaphorical, but I'm not sure he used those words. But that's kind of, I think, what's going on. And that's why I see where's the place to break partisan gridlock, I suppose, is what I'm saying, where you can not only trade off politically, but also have an honest discussion. And by the way, I think that honest discussion means listening to people who feel economically displaced by migrants. That's part of it too.
But isn't this what happens when you empower the local? It almost of necessity and emboldens the federal to act in opposition. Or we make a recourse to the local, like we sort of flip federalism on its head when the federal is dysfunctional or discriminatory in ways that are violative of our sense of collective self. So this is the dynamic that results, right? This is your model. How can we avoid it?
Well, I mean, I think a different president would handle it.
Yeah, but a different president may not have pushed the immigration issue to this point of extremis.
That's true. But if there were a sort of a insulated space of state and local decision making, I mean, there are models of this around the world too. I mean, where other countries have a little bit more of a local voice and who can come in and that kind of thing. I mean, that suggests that there's a critical mass of decision making that's not necessarily federal. What I'm actually concerned with, this very much ties into your work, Claire, is that I think from Washington, D.C., immigrants are statistics. They're statistics. And I think that when they're your neighbor, they're not. I also think there's a time dimension to this, because I think there's a tendency at the federal level to think about just who's in front of you and who you can talk to, the current generation. I think there's more of a tendency to understand that if the person moves into the house down the street or even a mile away, they have kids, and those kids will have kids, and that's another thing. I mean, so as it may be obvious, I'm not a social scientist. I'm just sort of throwing out ideas, but I do think it's reasonable to say that there are these dimensions of thinking about things differently that may play out in a different kind of political space.
Yeah, it's hard when immigrants in the federal imagination are not just numbers, but political fodder in
That's true.
a very brutal
Right.
game.
Right.
Yeah. Do you want to jump in?
Well, yes, and I think in part the answer is what's going on in Minneapolis. You might, Lipsky, a famous political scientist, talked about street level bureaucrats at the state level, and there's some of that was going on prior to this recent administration. But I think what we're seeing is street level journalists in many ways with the filming, with the interviews. I was privy to, I think it was NPR, maybe CNN had a town hall, and I was very impressed with the quality of questions, the speakers themselves who were asking those questions. And the narrative that's coming out from these, if you will, neighbors who are outraged, it's courageous, it's scary. I'm not sure I could be on the front lines conveying that narrative. But I think we're seeing at least some shifting in that federal response. At least it seems to be, right? And so I think it's in part related to the work that you're already doing shaping that narrative. I know it as academics, it's extremely incremental. It's not enough, and it can be very, very frustrating. But I think part of the answer, what we can do, is what's going on in Minneapolis in terms of some of that.
Yeah,
distress.
there seems to be some slight mitigation at the federal level, but there has been this really community building effort in Minneapolis that for many is a source of great inspiration. And just to sort of combine what we've heard today into, I guess, sort of another question drawing on some of the terminology. Nomenclature for you is interesting because you talk about the migrant, the refugee, the immigrant. We've talked a lot about the stranger. We also talked about the neighbor. And I wonder if part of the empathy building exercise should be about, in some sense, discarding the language of migrant and refugee and exile and other, and adopting the language, or thinking of the other half of Zimmel's claim, the stranger is both near and far. Stranger is near, stranger is proximate. Maybe the stranger is the neighbor. So I wonder, just could this be part of the sort of the narrative exercise to rename what that person is?
Won't you be my neighbor?
Pardon me?
Won't you be my neighbor?
Yeah.
Be my neighbor. Yeah. I'm curious about your nomenclature in general and
Yeah, I
what
mean,
differences you identify.
I don't know how, I don't know how effectively we can do that, right? When, like, who is naming, I mean, at the end of the day, it is also a legal status. What you raised actually reminded me of some other data I have on how people respond to the term immigrant versus refugee versus asylum seeker. And it actually, we'd have to do this again now. This is from 2019 or 2021, so a few years ago. But folks, when you do this thermometer scale in terms of how warmly they feel towards immigrants, they feel pretty warmly. I mean, we're talking like 7.5 out of 10, 6, 7 out of 10, and they feel the same way towards the term immigrants and refugees. There's no difference really on average in how warmly people feel when we're asking them how they feel towards immigrants and refugees, but they feel less warmly towards asylum seekers. So for some reason, the term asylum seeker, and I've noticed this also, people don't have a good understanding of what an asylum seeker is, right? They think that it's somebody who cheated, who cut the line to get in, when really there's no difference between refugee and asylum seeker. It's just that the refugee was vetted outside the US and then brought in, and the asylum seeker came to the US and is asking for asylum, and that decision is being made while they're in the country. So that it's interesting. I do think that these terms do evoke different feelings, and you do notice that people feel less warmly towards asylum seekers.
Yeah. So words matter.
Yeah.
Terms matter.
Yeah.
And maybe you need to think of at least inserting more into the narrative that we construct the neighbor motif, and not leaving the stranger.
But I think this is something that the forces of exclusion do very well. Right? They call them illegals, right? The criminal illegals. I mean, they know that words matter.
Right. And I guess this relates to a question I had about the security vetting approach or the security vetting criteria and imparting that information. I mean, I totally understand that. At the same time, it kind of plays into the kind of security frame of the whole question, which, if you don't escape it, you're never going to escape the sense of the profound alienation or otherness of that outsider. I mean, security is, a kind of locked box, it seems to me. And I wonder what you're thinking and how do you feel about that criterion as, a source of reassurance? Don't worry, they've been adequately vetted by our national security and surveillance system. Somehow,
but I think we can't escape that, especially because of, I think that, it really started with the Syrian refugee crisis and what you saw in Europe with the Syrian refugee crisis, where there were some security concerns. And you have folks in the US kind of picking up on that. And,
and we have the German example, though, right?
Sorry?
We have the German example where Merkel kind of swept it away in some sense.
Yeah, yeah.
Said, we
And in France too.
prioritize
Yeah.
the principle of kindness to the stranger at the expense of the punitive security risk.
Yeah, and I
Now, we
think,
can talk about how it's gone, but that
But
is model.
but I think we have to recognize that like the average American cares about security, cares about rule of law, and I think they care about order, things being done orderly. So you just have to recognize that's what the average American cares about. And I think we have an answer to that, right? We do have a process that vets refugees.
And refugees have been amply vetted.
Yeah.
Right.
So the word that I think strikes me as very frequent and really stands out in all the executive orders we got in 2025 is the word invasion. And so this is the taking of security to putting it in that form. So I think it's worth reflecting on how that word came up or what the path is, because my sense of this is that we had different patterns of migration around the year for 2000. Certainly it had grown quite a bit by 2015. But, and this goes back, Claire, to something you said, that we don't have migration leads to a lot of pressure on asylum because we don't really have other pathways because of the lack of other reforms that might have taken place. So migration leads to an asylum crisis, but you can only get asylum by reaching the borders. So migration becomes an asylum crisis, becomes a border crisis. Then regulation becomes, well, there's a physical wall. As long as there's a physical wall, there should be a legal wall. That's immigration. And so that basically means that the pathway is to migration, to asylum, to the border, to invasion. And the next word is emergency, right? So that's the progress here.
That's logically, yeah.
And that's antithetical really to the notion that what's going on here is building communities. Now, I think there's a lot of debate about how we build communities. I'm not suggesting that it's simple, but at least it's a more honest debate that doesn't put a finger on the scale of thinking about this invasion, because that's when then basically then you're talking, that's what justifies National Guard.
Okay. Can I clarify or seek to clarify something that you said that I wasn't sure I understood? The push in California towards sanctuary status.
Yeah.
Are you suggesting that it can have an opposite reaction in a neighboring state, and therefore what?
Wait, I'm not sure I understand that.
When you talked about California and the push towards inclusion, right, by granting sanctuary status, you then mentioned Arizona as a counterexample. Are you suggesting there is a causal connection between those two? And therefore California should avoid sort of what might be deemed an extreme action in order to avoid an extreme reaction?
I'm not sure it's what I think you'd call a causal connection, but I mean, I think it's part of the randomness of politics in this country. But all I was really trying to suggest is that it's not hypocritical, to put it very bluntly. It's not hypocritical to say there should be protective and inclusive measures, but we're not going to empower police to decide discretionarily who to arrest. I think that those are different kinds of state and local decision-making possibilities.
Wait, can you explain that term?
Because I think that if California has a law that says you can have a driver's license regardless of immigration status, I don't think there's discretion in the granting of driver's licenses, or at least the application of that criteria. But I think if you have state and local police empowered to enforce federal immigration law, because there are so many people in the country without status, which is a function of the system, then that means that a local police officer gets to decide whom to arrest. And if that's the case, the risk of undetected and unremedied discrimination is very high. And I think that is a risk that it's not the same thing as giving someone a driver's license. If there were enforcement, if there were enforcement that's non-discretionary, then I think that there's a lot more possibility for state and local enforcement. What I really don't want to do is to say, because you, California, are giving in-state tuition, we're going to also empower state and local police to decide who to arrest. I think the former is much more ministerial. In other words, driver's licenses and state tuitions, things like that. But as long as we have the system we have with so many people without status, for I think historical reasons, as long as that's the case, I'm troubled that on the enforcement side, if that is basically allowing local police to make decisions about whether they're going to, how they're going to arrest people. That's. I don't think they're symmetrical. I don't think they're symmetrical. I think what would be symmetrical is some type of a much more automatically applied enforcement, but that's not what we're seeing.
Okay, I'm going to turn to you for questions in just a minute, but I want to ask Abel a final question about the day laborers in your study from 24 years ago. And just ask you to reflect on, what you think it would take societally, maybe operating at the local level, to reimagine day laborers who are so essential to society, to the economy, to reimagine them from being strangers to being neighbors,
Right.
and what it looks like through their eyes.
You're seeing some really interesting efforts here in Los Angeles and Pasadena with a community that's been working with day laborers for many, many years. And so you're having basically neighborhoods coming together in part because of the Eaton fire and the role that day laborers had historically in that space, but especially afterwards with the cleanup and now the rebuilding. And so it's fundamentally a local sort of issue, which I think gives me more hope that these narratives at least are at the local level. We need to get them permeate upwards. And we're seeing some of these examples, just not enough. It's interesting that 24 years ago, when I was talking about the characteristics of day laborers and I said it was buried in the middle, that was done purposefully because I also had data on their undocumented status. I was very worried that these men who stand in public spaces could draw attention. They themselves told me, no, don't worry about that. Everybody knows that most of us don't have documents. Again, it was back to the narrative, the empathy. And so I think I'd like to leave my comment on the importance of, if you will, humanizing and how that message is portrayed beyond the day laborers themselves, i.e. folks like us in this room, neighbors, cousins, relatives, our children who hang out and play with undocumented immigrants as well as immigrants who have papers. There's something very, very powerful about some of the shift that we're seeing as a result of 2 deaths and other sorts of horrific injustices on the streets of Twin Cities and other parts of the country.
Okay, that seems like a good opportunity to pivot to our audience. As we do, I just want to let you know that the interns of the Bedari Institute who are here with us are setting up after this presentation to capture your impressions of what you heard. So if you are interested in speaking to our interns, please make your way to the interns who are here, who are, raise your hands, please. So Lynn and Hannah and yeah, and Shreya in the back. Okay, so you have lots of opportunities. Okay, with that, yes, please, question. I think the microphone is coming to you.
I thank you so much. I think it was very, very interesting. I think it would be helpful for you to start out with a definition of empathy.
Mm-hmm.
Of amnesty? Amnesty?
Empathy.
Empathy.
What you mean by empathy? I teach that here.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that it would be very helpful in your speech because people have all kinds of misconceptions.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry that I didn't do that. That's like a big oops. Well, there's different conceptions of empathy, different definitions of empathy. I think about it, the ability to put yourself in the other person's shoes. And, there's different types. Well, but the audience, there's different types of empathy. There's more cognitive empathy, just kind of imagining without really sharing the emotion of the person. And then there's more hot empathy where there's more sharing of emotions. But there's a lot of there's even more types of empathy than that. But the way that I think about it is our ability to imagine ourselves in the other person, which is kind of the Adam Smith definition of fellow feelings.
Hannah? Yes. Michael.
First, thank you for all those different perspectives on immigration. I think tonight was super enlightening. I wanted to sort of raise the concept of the perpetual foreigner stereotype that I hear a lot applied, especially to Asian Americans, because I loved our discussion on labels such as foreigner versus neighbor. But I think that so to contextualize, I feel like a lot of Asian Americans are asked, "Oh, where are you from?" And then we say, "Oh, Southern California." "Oh no, where are you really from?" So I feel like in the past, when I learned U.S. history, there has been the conception of Irish or German or Italian immigrants or Southern and Eastern Europeans seen as foreigners in America. But eventually they came to be seen as Americans. So I was wondering, how long does it take for immigrant group to be seen as American? And maybe is it more difficult if there's a racialized component to it? And maybe is it even possible if it's combined with racialized components?
Excellent.
I don't know, should I try that? I mean, so I don't know how long it takes. I do know that it matters where you are in the country. I mean, I know that from my own experience. When I moved to Los Angeles, I moved from North Carolina. And I went to a Starbucks, ordered a latte, and they asked me, "What's your name?" And I said, "Hiroshi," and I started spelling it. And she looked at me and said, "What are you spelling that for?" Nothing that would have happened when I was in high school in San Francisco, a while back. And so it's really hard to say, but I do think that this is a useful lens to understand what's going on now, because I think we really have in contest of you're American, no, you're really American, right? Because of some of the challenges or the attempts to redefine citizenship is an attempt to really write out of citizenship people who had parents who were working here or maybe undocumented, but not just undocumented, also people who were graduate students here, that kind of thing. So I think the law plays a role in saying who's really American, and I think that dovetails with some of the perpetual foreigner phenomena that we see. And I think it is racialized, but the racialization is really, I think racialization is interestingly regional.
I think it also depends on who you ask. Like if you look at the cues that Border Patrol and ICE officials are using to discriminate, they're looking at they're paying attention to accents and to skin color, and so all of a sudden you have folks who probably thought they were assimilated Americans have now been deemed to be foreigners. So I think there are groups of people for whom all those, if you're not kind of white Christian, then you are not American. And unfortunately, those are the folks who those are the folks who are making policy right now. So it really depends on who you ask. But yeah, point taken about Asian Americans. Sure.
We have a question. Yeah, I think we'll take two questions. This person, I think, had his hand up first, and then we'll go to that person. And then with that, we'll wrap up. We have a reception that awaits us. So please.
Excellent panel, and thank you so much for the great talk. My name is Jordan, and I teach in Asian languages and cultures here. Right now I'm teaching Japanese poetry and psychology, and there's a lot of research that shows that poetry also increases, empathy. And wouldn't you know it, I can't get anyone to read the damn stuff unless I'm grading them. And so my question for you is, your research has outlined a really exciting potential tactic to use in changing minds and hearts, right? So, and that's within your field. If you could pass the baton then to someone, and that baton could also endow them with the ability to actually get, let's say, non-empathetic people to sit down and allow themselves to be immersed in some of the information and the narratives that might increase the kinds of changes in the action that you're talking about, who would you hand the baton to, and what would you want to happen for that part 2 of your research entering the world?
Great. Hold on to that. You have a little bit of time to think about that, because we'll move directly, Dory, to the next question, the final question of the presentation.
Thank you so much for your time. My question is very quick. For me, I'm of the perspective that kindness is an action. So I'm curious what your favorite preferred way of exercising kindness to a stranger is.
Great. Thank you. Okay. Perfect.
Oh,
Answer that one.
Yeah.
That's the same.
I think inviting them for a home-cooked meal is one of the ways in which inviting a newcomer to my home for a home-cooked meal with my family. Should we go around before
Yeah,
I get?
let's do a round. Let's do a lightning round.
Well, I'll tell you what's the first thing that comes into my head. I think kindness is listening deeply and concentrating on what they're saying and not seeing it through how it relates to what you were doing that day.
I'll greet people that I may not know, and I'll try to be as authentic as possible and ask them how they are doing and feeling, and really try to listen and look at them in the eye and try to understand where they're coming from.
Yeah, and I'll ask 2 answers to your question. One echoes what Claire said, opening up my home to our home to those whom we know, those whom we don't know, those who are near, those who are far, without discrimination. And an answer that my colleagues know well, they've heard me say it many times, that relates more to campus and campus discourse. And it is the question, could you please tell me what you mean? My tendency is usually to attribute to the worst possible meaning for something you say. And it really relates to what Hiroshi said about not just listening, but hearing. And I think an important gesture is to bestow the respect upon someone that you feel that you can learn from what they actually are going to tell you. So that for me is really an act of kindness. Now maybe we can double back to the first question.
Yeah.
Again, with Japanese poetry and psychology.
So there is research that looks at the role, empathy research that looks at the role of the arts and entertainment in generating empathy. I haven't done any of that research, but I know there are others who are working on this. I think teachers, right? You're assigning poetry, but I would start at a younger age. I think there was a study, I think in Canada, with young, like elementary school kids, that had them take the position of a newborn, like pretend you're a newborn and lay down and imagine yourself as a newborn. And somehow this exercise just like incredibly increased their empathy. So I think, I do think that we all have kind of a different baseline capacity to empathize, but I also think you can work on it. And I think that when you're young, you can just like every other skill, you just learn it better when you're young. I think introducing empathy in curriculum in schools, empathy exercises in curriculum in schools might be phase 2 of the research, maybe.
So I'm going to focus on a different dimension of your question, which is really the medium in which we say things. Right? I mean, it strikes me that poetry goes to a different part of your mind and your heart as compared to reading a text and that kind of thing. And we can do all the academic writing we want, but it may be the TV show that really matters. Right? And so 2 quick examples. I mean, I was asked a few years ago to give a talk on citizenship on campus for general audience. And instead of giving a talk, I took my guitar and played different verses of This Land Is Your Land and talked about how it focused different aspects of citizenship. It's really true. The other thing that's really sobering for me is that, I've written books and stuff like that. And I was asked a few years ago to be the straight man in a Try Guys video. I don't know if that means anything to you, but anyway, I don't know. Okay, it's a Try Guys video, and they said we want you to help us try immigrating to America. So we did this video, and so I was just floored by the fact I never even heard of these people before, but I was floored by the fact that that video has 8 million views practically now. And so I figured, well, that really put me in my place as the medium that matters.
Yeah. Yeah. I just, in following up on what Claire said, I just want to, remembering a colleague of hers now at Stanford, whom she mentioned in her presentation, Abel Valenzuela, who was the first person to speak in our, maybe the second person to speak in our Compassionate Conversation series last year, who wrote a book called The War for Kindness, in which he reminds us, based on his very interesting empirical research, that kindness is not an innate quality. Kindness is a muscle that we can develop and build up over time. And it seems to me an exceptionally valuable lesson to be reminded of in these times. We are going to now bring it in the formal part of our evening. We have a reception that awaits us. Those of you who are interested, please make your way to our interns to share your impressions. I want to just conclude by thanking all who made it possible: Dory, Annalise, Peter Evans from Social Science Development, Felicia, Amaya, Megan, Maya, and our interns from the BKI staff. And above all, thank our speakers today, first and foremost, Claire Adida for the super stimulating presentation. Hiroshi and Abel, thank you so much as well. And please join us at the reception.